Sophia Lane's body trembled with exhaustion as she cradled the tiny newborn against her chest. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast a sterile glow over the delivery room, amplifying every shadow that passed across her pale face. Sweat still clung to her temples, damp strands of hair plastered to her cheeks, but her focus was entirely on the fragile child in her arms. The infant's cry had quieted to a faint whimper, small fists curling instinctively toward the warmth of her body. For a moment, Sophia felt a wave of peace wash over her, the kind of fragile peace that came only when holding new life, but it was shattered the instant the door opened and Alexander Cross entered. He carried himself like a storm made flesh. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that looked completely out of place in a maternity ward, Alexander's presence shifted the air. Nurses fell silent, one even backing away as his piercing gaze swept across the room. His reputation had always preceded him in the business world. A billionaire CEO who never tolerated weakness. And that reputation followed him now, pressing down on Sophia like a weight she could not bear. She pulled the blanket higher over her son, as though the thin cotton could shield him from Alexander's stare. The silence stretched until Alexander's polished shoes echoed against the tile. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his expression carved in stone. Sophia's lips trembled. She wanted to say his name to remind him of the night when his mask had slipped and he had been human, not the ruthless executive the world worshipped or feared. But before she could, Alexander reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a check. He laid it flat on the small hospital table beside her bed with a motion so deliberate it felt rehearsed. The white slip of paper glared under the light, its blankness almost taunting. His voice when it came was low and merciless. "That baby is not mine. Take the money. Disappear." Sophia flinched as if the words were physical blows. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared speak. Her throat burned as she tried to form a protest, yet her body felt frozen. She stared at the check, at the sharp strokes of his signature, scrawled across the bottom, as though all the intimacy they once shared had been reduced to ink and digits. Her baby stirred in her arms and let out a faint cry. Sophia lowered her gaze to the infant trying to draw strength from his tiny presence. That was when it happened. His eyes fluttered open for the first time since birth. Wide and unguarded, they were not the cloudy eyes of a newborn, still adjusting to light. They were storm gray, the exact same shade as Alexander's. The nurses noticed. One inhaled sharply. Sophia felt her heart twist painfully in her chest. She looked back at Alexander, hoping he too would see what was undeniable. For a fleeting second, his composure cracked. His gaze locked on the child's eyes, and something flickered in his expression, a flash of recognition, so brief it might have been imagined. But just as quickly he tore his eyes away, his jaw tightening. The denial came again, harsher this time, as though he was fighting not Sophia, but himself. "That baby is not mine." His voice echoed against the sterile walls. He turned, adjusting his cufflinks as if shaking off invisible chains. One of the nurses whispered under her breath, incredulous. But Alexander strode from the room without another glance. The door swung shut behind him, leaving only the echo of his footsteps and the lingering scent of expensive cologne. Sophia stared at the closed door until her vision blurred with tears. The check remained on the table, an accusation more than a gift, and she hated it with every fiber of her being. Her arms tightened protectively around her son. She kissed his forehead, her tears falling onto his soft skin. In that moment, she made a silent vow. No matter what Alexander said, no matter what the world believed, she would raise her son with love. She would not let him feel abandoned. The child blinked up at her, those storm-gray eyes, impossibly steady. They seemed to hold a truth that Alexander refused to face. Sophia whispered to him through trembling lips, "Your father may deny you, but I never will." Outside the delivery room, the hospital hallway buzzed faintly with activity, but inside Sophia's world had narrowed to the weight of her baby and the hollow space where Alexander should have stood. She felt the sting of humiliation, the sharp edge of betrayal. Yet beneath it all, a fire of defiance ignited. This was only the beginning. The world would know the truth, whether Alexander accepted it or not. Her son's eyes would make sure of that. Sophia Lane had not chosen the life of a maid because it was her dream, but because life left her little choice. Her father's health had declined after years of construction work, and her younger sister still struggled through community college. Bills piled up like bricks with no mortar to hold them together, and Sophia, with her quiet resilience, took the first job that promised stability. That job led her through the iron gates of the Cross Estate, a mansion that overlooked Los Angeles with arrogant grandeur, its marble pillars and manicured gardens, a sharp contrast to the modest apartment she left behind each dawn. Inside the estate, Sophia became invisible. The other staff spoke in hushed tones around her. Some scoffed when she failed to polish silverware with the perfection demanded by the head housekeeper, and others whispered cruelly that she would not last a month. Yet she endured, moving through the gilded halls with steady hands and downcast eyes. Her life intersected only rarely with Alexander Cross himself, a man who commanded every space he entered like a king surveying his court. He was tall, impeccably dressed, his expression rarely betraying more than a flicker of impatience. The newspapers called him a prodigy, a billionaire who expanded his empire before the age of 35. Yet within the estate, he was a shadow often away. On business and when he was home, his presence chilled the air. To Sophia, he seemed untouchable, the kind of man who lived on magazine covers and in whispers, but never in the realm of ordinary people. But the night everything changed began, with sorrow not scandal. It was the anniversary of his mother's death, a detail Sophia overheard from another maid who muttered that the master of the house had become unpredictable on this date. The mansion was unusually silent, the staff dismissed early, and Sophia lingered only because she had been assigned to tidy the library before dawn. She was dusting the shelves when she heard footsteps stagger across the marble foyer. Alexander appeared in the doorway, tie undone, the sharp lines of his face softened by grief and alcohol. A half-empty glass of whiskey trembled in his hand. For the first time, Sophia saw not the CEO from the headlines, but a man undone by loneliness. He dropped heavily into a chair, rubbing his temples, muttering words that tangled with pain. She hesitated, unsure whether to leave, but something in the slump of his shoulders held her still. He looked up, then his eyes unfocused, yet piercing, and said softly, "I did everything for her, and now she is gone." Sophia's heart clenched. She had lost her own mother young and recognized the hollow echo of grief. Against every rule drilled into her as staff, she stepped closer, placing the dust cloth aside. "You do not have to carry it alone," she whispered. unsure why she dared speak at all. He studied her silent, as though measuring the weight of her words. Then, with a sigh that seemed to deflate years of iron control, he gestured for her to sit. She perched on the edge of the armchair across from him, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. They spoke haltingly at first about memories, regrets, the pressure of expectation, until the distance between Billionaire and Maid seemed to thin into something human. Hours slipped by unnoticed. The whiskey glass emptied, and his voice grew rawer, his truth spilling out with every sip. Sophia listened, offering no judgment, only presence. When his head bowed and his shoulders shook, once briefly betraying tears, her hand reached across the divide of space, almost of its own accord. She touched his arm, gentle grounding. He looked at her then, with eyes that burned not with anger, but with need. "Just stay," he murmured, the words breaking against his lips like a confession. "Just stay for tonight." Her breath caught. Every instinct told her to retreat, to remember her place. But his vulnerability pulled her in with the gravity of a collapsing star. She nodded, once her heart pounding. That night was a blur of quiet words and trembling touches, of Alexander lowering his guard, and Sophia stepping across lines she never thought she would cross. He cupped her face with a tenderness that surprised them both, fingers brushing away the fear in her expression. "You deserve more than this," she thought but did not say, afraid to shatter the fragile spell. When dawn crept through the curtains, reality returned like a slap. Alexander was no longer the grieving man from the night before, but the impenetrable CEO, again already dressed in his armor of composure. He did not meet her eyes as he adjusted his cufflinks, his voice clipped. "Last night never happened. Do you understand?" Sophia's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to ask what it had meant, but his gaze was already cold steel, forbidding any plea. She swallowed her words and lowered her head. "Yes, Mr. Cross." And just like that, the barrier between their worlds reassembled stronger than ever. He left the room without looking back, and Sophia gathered herself slowly, feeling both cherished and discarded, a contradiction that burned in her chest. She returned to her duties, carrying the memory like a secret flame she could neither extinguish nor share. It was the night that would change everything, though neither of them could see how its echoes would ripple through their lives, leading them inexorably toward the hospital room months later, where denial would collide with truth in the storm-gray eyes of their child. Sophia Lane discovered the truth in the cramped bathroom of her apartment, a white plastic stick clutched in her shaking hands. 2 pink lines glowed back at her undeniable permanent. Her knees buckled against the cold tile floor as the weight of reality pressed down. She was carrying Alexander Cross's child, a child conceived in one night, that should never have happened, a night he had already erased with a single command. She pressed her palm over her mouth to muffle the sob that threatened to escape, fear and wonder colliding inside her chest. She thought about her father's fragile health, her sister's tuition, the gossiping staff back at the mansion, who would laugh if they knew. But then she placed her hand over her stomach and whispered to the silent life within, "You are mine. Whatever comes, you are mine." From that moment she carried the secret alone. She never tried to reach Alexander. His warning had been clear, his world far removed from hers, and she knew he would deny it even if she stood on his doorstep. Instead, she picked up extra shifts at a small diner off Sunset Boulevard, the kind of place where truckers and night owls came for greasy eggs and stale coffee. The hours were long, her feet ached, and the smell of fried oil clung to her uniform. But the paycheck kept the lights on and stocked the fridge. When customers sneered at her growing belly or muttered crude jokes, she bit her tongue and forced a polite smile. At night, when exhaustion pressed her down into the thin mattress she shared with her sister, she took out a battered notebook and wrote letters to the child she carried. "One day your father will see you." She scribbled, though, whether it was a promise or a prayer, she could not tell. The months dragged forward. Doctor visits were paid. With tips, hand-me-down clothes arrived in bags left by Mrs. Hernandez, the elderly neighbor who seemed to sense more than Sophia confessed. That woman's wrinkled hands often lingered on Sophia's belly, her eyes soft with unspoken knowledge. "You are stronger than you think," she would say. Sophia clung to those words when her own father passed away, unexpectedly, his heart giving out in his sleep. She buried him with borrowed money and held her sister close, whispering that they would survive. In the quiet of her grief, she spoke to her unborn child, promising that he would never feel abandoned, never wonder if he was wanted. The day of birth came with a storm pounding outside. Sophia labored in the sterile room, sweat soaking her brow, fear and anticipation warring inside. No hand held hers, no familiar face sat by her side except Mrs. Hernandez, who muttered prayers in Spanish and wiped Sophia's forehead with cool cloths. When the final cry split the air and the nurse placed the squirming infant in her arms, the world shifted. The baby's face was scrunched, his fists trembling with indignation at the cold air. But when his tiny head nestled against her chest, Sophia felt an overwhelming surge of love that dwarfed every hardship she had endured. She wept freely, pressing kiss after kiss to his soft crown. "You are my everything now," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. She named him Ethan, a name that meant strong and enduring, because she knew he would need both. That first night in the hospital, she barely slept. She memorized every feature, every tiny sound. When Ethan whimpered, she rocked him gently, humming lullabies her mother once sang. The checkered blanket provided by the hospital seemed far too thin to shield him from the harshness of the world, so she wrapped him tighter in her arms and vowed she would be his fortress. Outside, Los Angeles pulsed with its usual chaos, cars streaking past under neon lights. But inside that small room, her world narrowed to the weight of 7 pounds of fragile perfection. Yet even in those sacred hours, shadows lurked. Sophia knew the whispers would come once she returned home. People would speculate, tongues would wag about who fathered the child, and some might even guess the truth. She dreaded the possibility that Alexander's name might surface dreaded even more. The thought of his rejection becoming public spectacle. She imagined him standing coldly in front of cameras, denying her and their child with the same ruthless precision he used in boardrooms. The fear pressed on her, but when she looked into Ethan's half-closed eyes, she found courage. "These eyes will never lie," she murmured, brushing her lips across his temple. The following weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Sophia walked the floor of her apartment at 3 a.m, humming to soothe Ethan's cries, her own eyes stinging with exhaustion. The diner took her back quickly, not out of kindness, but because shifts needed filling. She strapped Ethan into a second-hand stroller and brought him to Mrs. Hernandez when she worked. promising her son she would return each night. Each day was a struggle, but also a triumph, proof that she could survive without help from the man who had denied them. Still, in her weakest moments when Ethan slept and the apartment was quiet, Sophia would remember Alexander's touch from that single night, the way his voice had cracked when he whispered, "Stay." She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he ever suspected the truth, growing miles away from his glittering world. But she shoved those thoughts aside. Dreams of reconciliation would not buy diapers or pay rent. She clung instead to the simple rituals of survival, to the sound of Ethan's steady breathing, to the way his tiny fingers curled around hers, as if he already trusted her to carry them both through the storm. In the silence of her life, Sophia learned resilience. Her body carried the scars of labor, her heart bore the scars of rejection, but she refused to crumble. For Ethan, she would endure every whisper, every sneer, every lonely night. He was her anchor, her proof of love's existence in a world that seemed built to deny it. The whispers started small, a ripple through the neighborhood when Sophia returned from the hospital with Ethan bundled in her arms. At first, it was only sideways glances from neighbors who lingered too long. On the child's gray eyes muttered comments at the diner about how maids always dreamed too high. But whispers rarely stayed whispers for long. And one night when Sophia was rocking Ethan to sleep, she saw her own face splashed across a gossip site. The headline screamed in bold, "Billionaire's Maid claims love child." Her stomach dropped, her knees almost buckling. The article carried grainy photos of her, leaving the hospital, Ethan tucked close to her chest, alongside a file photo of Alexander Cross taken at a charity gala. The contrast between them was cruelly clear, and the article painted her as a gold digger chasing a payday. Within hours, paparazzi descended. Cameras flashed outside her apartment, their shouts piercing the night as Ethan stirred and wailed in fright. Sophia pulled him closer, heart-pounding blinds drawn tight, but there was no escape. The story had caught fire. Hashtags trended online. Billionaire baby scandal to Cross affair. People she had once called friends avoided her eyes on the street, while strangers sent venomous messages calling her a liar and worse. At the diner, customers whispered in earshot, their forks scraping against plates in disapproval. The manager, red-faced and nervous, pulled her aside one morning and said he could not afford the attention. He handed her final wages in a small envelope, avoiding her gaze as though shame were contagious. Jobless, humiliated, yet clutching Ethan close, Sophia whispered to him that she would not break. Across town, in the gleaming tower of Cross Industries, Alexander convened with his board. They were livid. Stock prices wavered, investors called with concern, and Alexander's polished empire quivered under the weight of scandal. The PR team drafted statements, careful words meant to distance him without fanning the flames, but Alexander's patience snapped. Enough, he barked, his voice slicing through the conference room. "I will handle it myself." Against the cautious advice of lawyers and executives, he scheduled a press conference. Flashbulbs exploded as he strode onto the stage. His jaw set his presence commanding. Reporters jostled for position, microphones crowding forward. At his side stood his attorney, a polished woman in a navy suit, who adjusted her glasses before speaking into the microphone. "Mr. Cross has no connection to this woman or her child," she declared crisply. These allegations are baseless and malicious, intended to exploit his name for financial gain. The room buzzed pens, scratching furiously across notepads. Alexander stood impassive, but his eyes narrowed as one reporter shouted, "What about the eyes Mr. Cross people are saying? The child looks exactly like you." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The attorney opened her mouth to respond, but Alexander cut her off. His voice thundered over the crowd, raw and unfiltered. "She is lying. That baby is not mine." The effect was instant. The room erupted, cameras flashing, like lightning reporters shouting over one another, the attorney's expression faltering for the first time. In that single outburst, Alexander had given the story new life, and the headlines wrote themselves: "Billionaire explodes, at press conference denies baby in rage." Sophia watched from her tiny apartment, Ethan sleeping against her chest, as the television blared his denial. Her heart twisted painfully at the sight of his face, the same man who once whispered, "Stay now," spitting venom to the world. Tears blurred her vision as she muted the television. She pressed a kiss to Ethan's forehead, whispering fiercely, "These eyes never lie." Outside, the scandal only grew. Memes circulated, comparing Alexander's storm gray eyes to Ethan's. Talk shows debated whether Sophia was telling the truth or spinning a tale. The internet dissected every expression, every slip of Alexander's composure, feeding on the drama like vultures. Meanwhile, Sophia could not step outside without feeling cameras follow her, their lenses hungry for another shot of the supposed gold digger and her child. At the grocery store, she heard whispers behind, her cruel laughter at the checkout line. She held her head high, refusing to cry in front of strangers. But once home, the tears came silent and bitter. Yet even as humiliation pressed down, she found strength in Ethan. She would cradle him close, stare into his gray eyes that mirrored Alexander's so perfectly, and remind herself that truth had its own power. Someday those eyes would speak louder than any headline. Back in his penthouse, Alexander stared at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittering beneath him. His own storm-gray eyes stared back, haunted. For the briefest moment at the press conference, he had faltered when asked about the resemblance. He had seen the photograph, the undeniable echo in the child's gaze, and it had shaken him more than he cared to admit. But denial was easier than truth. Truth threatened everything he had built, every carefully crafted wall. So he chose denial again, even as it hollowed him from the inside. The city did not sleep, and neither did the scandal. And in the silence of her apartment, Sophia held Ethan tighter, whispering promises into the night. "You will know love," she vowed. "You will know truth, no matter how loudly the world denies you." The fallout from Alexander's outburst was swift and merciless. Stock tickers glowed red as Cross Industries shares dipped overnight, wiping millions from the company's value. News anchors dissected his every word, their voices looping across 24-hour cycles, while op-ed writers questioned his stability as a leader. Investors called in droves, some demanding reassurances, others hinting at pulling out entirely. The board of directors convened an emergency session, their faces grim under fluorescent lights. One elderly member leaned forward, his tone clipped. "This is not about your personal life anymore, Alexander. This is about the survival of the company." Alexander sat at the head of the table, his jaw rigid, but inside he could feel the cracks widening. His empire was shaking, and it all circled back, to a woman he wanted to forget, and a child he refused to claim. Yet even denial could not stop the relentless hunger of the press. Tabloids splashed Sophia's name across their covers, digging into her past. They found her high school yearbook photo, her father's obituary, her part-time jobs at grocery stores and diners. Headlines screamed, "The maid who wants a billionaire's baby gold digger," or "mother scorned." Old neighbors offered quotes for cash-twisting half-truths into damning portraits. Sophia felt the walls closing in. She could not walk to the corner store without being followed, cameras flashing, as Ethan squirmed in her arms. Each photograph was dissected, online commenters debating whether she looked like a schemer or a victim. The weight of public judgment pressed harder than the loss of her job at the diner, harder than the whispers in her neighborhood. She began skipping meals so Ethan could have enough, her own body growing thinner under the strain. One evening, as rain drummed against her small apartment window, she sat with Mrs. Hernandez at the worn kitchen table. The older woman clasped Sophia's hands firmly. "Truth will fight for itself, child," she said, her eyes fierce. "Do not let his denial make you doubt your worth." Sophia nodded, though tears blurred her vision. She wanted to believe those words, but each day, survival felt like pushing a boulder uphill. Meanwhile, Alexander grew restless. At night, he stood before mirrors in his penthouse, staring into his own storm-gray eyes, until they seemed to mock him. Sleep eluded him, replaced by flashes of the child he had glimpsed in photographs. Those eyes haunted him, familiar and unrelenting, a truth he could not bury, no matter how hard he tried. He drank more, working later hours, pushing himself ruthlessly to maintain control. But even in boardrooms, he sometimes caught his reflection and saw not himself but the boy. One night he awoke drenched in sweat from a dream he could not escape. In it, a child stood in a darkened hallway, eyes glinting gray, whispering "Daddy," before dissolving into shadow. Alexander pressed his palms into his eyes, but the image lingered. In the wider world, the scandal grew legs of its own. Protesters gathered outside Cross Industries headquarters, some demanding accountability, others waving signs that read, "Fathers should not abandon their children." Late-night comedians made jokes at Alexander's expense, mocking his denial, while activists used the story as a rallying cry against powerful men who thought they could silence women with money. Sophia's name trended daily. Her face splashed across screens, but rarely with kindness. Commenters dissected the way she dressed, the way she held Ethan, even the way she smiled through exhaustion. Yet through it all, she refused to break. She walked Ethan in the park on quiet mornings, whispering lullabies into his ear, vowing that his identity would not be reduced to hashtags or headlines. Still, the fear gnawed at her. Rent notices piled up. Employers turned her away once they realized who she was. Mrs. Hernandez offered food and comfort, but Sophia hated being a burden. At night, she sat by Ethan's crib, scribbling in her notebook. "One day your father will see you," she wrote. "He will see the truth in your eyes." She closed the notebook and pressed a kiss to her son's forehead, clinging to that fragile hope. Across town, Alexander stood in his bathroom, staring into the mirror after another sleepless night. For the briefest second, he swore he saw not his own reflection, but Ethan's face, those gray eyes staring back at him, unblinking, undeniable. He gripped the sink until his knuckles whitened. His denial was unraveling thread by thread, but pride held him back. He could not admit weakness, not yet. The city roared with speculation, the world buzzing with judgment, and in the silence of their separate lives, both Sophia and Alexander felt the storm building. Neither could know that the storm would soon force them to collide again, under the unrelenting gaze of those storm-gray eyes that refused to be denied. The morning sun broke through a thin veil of clouds as Sophia pushed Ethan's stroller along the worn path of Griffith Park. She chose early hours to avoid the stairs to steal a pocket of peace before the world remembered her name again. Ethan cooed softly, his tiny fingers clutching the edge of his blanket. Sophia bent down to tuck it tighter around him, whispering, "You are safe with me, my love." She did not notice the figure who had paused at the edge of the path, a man in a dark coat with sunglasses masking his eyes. Alexander Cross had come there by accident, or so he told himself. A meeting downtown had been delayed, and he needed to outrun the suffocating weight of scandal that clung to him like smoke. But as he walked, his gaze had snagged on the stroller ahead, on the woman bending over it, and his chest tightened in recognition. He almost turned back. He should have turned back, yet his feet moved forward of their own accord until he stood a few feet away, silence stretching taut between them. Sophia looked up, her breath catching. The last time she had seen him was on a glowing screen, his voice sharp as he denied her and their child to the entire world. Now he was here, real and solid, and for a heartbeat she wanted to scream at him, to pour every wound into the air. But Ethan stirred, then his little eyes opening to meet the world. Gray eyes, storm gray, as clear as a mirror. Alexander's breath hitched. He removed his sunglasses slowly, as if stripping away his armor, and stared. The child blinked up at him, innocent yet piercing, and something inside Alexander shifted, a plate tectonic crack, splitting the surface of his denial. His hand twitched at his side, aching to reach forward, but Sophia's protective glare stopped him. She adjusted the blanket again, her fingers brushing against his by accident. The touch was electric, a jolt of memory from the night when everything had begun. Both froze, caught in a moment that neither could control. Sophia pulled her hand back quickly, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "Do not pretend you care. You made your choice." Alexander swallowed his throat dry. He wanted to argue, to insist that the child could not be his, but the evidence was staring back at him with every blink. The world around them faded to nothing, only the stroller, the boy, and those eyes that mirrored his own. Paparazzi lurked nearby, cameras hidden behind long lenses. They had followed Sophia for weeks, and today fortune rewarded them. The shutter clicks were soft but insistent, capturing the billionaire, pausing over a stroller, his hand dangerously close to the child's blanket, his gaze locked on the boy's face. By evening, those photos would dominate every social feed, side-by-side comparisons of father and son impossible to ignore. Hashtags would surge again, but eyes don't lie, cross baby. For now, though, Sophia only saw the man who had broken her heart. Standing uninvited in her fragile sanctuary, she straightened, her voice laced with defiance. "If you want to end this, take the test." The words hung in the cool morning air, a gauntlet thrown between them. Alexander's jaw clenched, his pride screaming at him to walk away. But his eyes betrayed him. He could not unsee the resemblance, could not silence the whisper of truth clawing at his chest. He nodded once curtly, before turning on his heel and striding away. Sophia stood trembling, torn between rage and relief. Ethan gurgled, oblivious, his tiny hand reaching upward, as if trying to grasp the fading figure of his father. She bent down, pressing a kiss to his forehead, whispering, "It is beginning, my love. It is beginning." By nightfall, the photos exploded online. News anchors replayed the images, drawing red circles around the matching eyes, fueling speculation with gleeful precision. Cross Industries issued a statement claiming Alexander had merely been surprised by the paparazzi and offered no further comment, but the tide was shifting. Investors demanded clarity. Activists rallied louder. And in the quiet of his penthouse, Alexander poured himself another drink, staring out at the sprawling city lights. His reflections stared back at him in the glass, but all he could see were the eyes of the boy in the park, eyes that had pierced through every wall he had built. The storm inside him was only growing, and he knew the test would either shatter him completely or force him to finally face the truth he had denied for too long. The DNA results arrived in a sealed envelope that felt heavier than any corporate contract Alexander Cross had ever signed. He sat at his mahogany desk, the city skyline stretching behind him, but his eyes were locked on the paper as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. His attorney hovered nearby, urging caution, suggesting they could suppress it if necessary. But Alexander shook his head. He had demanded the test after the encounter in the park, after staring into eyes that mirrored his own, and now the truth waited only for him to read. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore the seal. One line leapt from the page with brutal clarity. Probability of paternity 99.9%. For a moment the world tilted, his breath stalling in his chest. He had expected relief if the child was not his, but instead a strange mixture of terror and awe flooded him. There was no denial left. Ethan was his son. He pushed the document across the desk, his voice rough. "It is true." The attorney cleared her throat, already planning a controlled press release. But Alexander stood abruptly, knocking back his chair. No scripts, no spin, I will face it myself. His decision terrified the board when they heard. They begged him to follow the prepared apology, a carefully crafted statement that would limit liability and salvage reputation, but Alexander refused. Days later, the press conference was announced. Cameras crowded into the grand hall of Cross Industries headquarters, reporters buzzing like hornets. The world was watching. Sophia did not plan to attend, but Mrs. Hernandez insisted. "This is not just his moment, child. This is yours too." Clutching Ethan close, Sophia walked into the hall just as Alexander stepped up to the podium. His suit was immaculate, his posture commanding, yet his face carried a shadow of weariness. The attorney began the speech, her voice smooth, talking about misunderstandings and private matters, about how Mr. Cross deeply regretted any confusion caused. The words were polished but hollow, and Sophia's heart clenched. She could not let him bury truth under rehearsed lines. Before the room could settle, she stood, her voice cutting through the air. "Do not apologize to me, Alexander. Be a father to him." Gasps rippled through the hall as every camera swung toward her. She stood tall, despite the weight of judgment. Ethan nestled against her chest, his wide gray eyes unblinking under the glare of lights. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Alexander froze, staring at her across the crowded room. The script in front of him blurred. He looked down at his son, really looked, and something in him shattered. The attorney tried to regain control, but the moment had already escaped her. Alexander gripped the podium, his voice raw. The test confirmed it. "He is my son. I denied it, and I was wrong." Reporters erupted, microphones thrust forward, but Alexander's gaze never left Sophia and Ethan. He continued louder now, as though speaking to more than the room. "I let pride blind me. I let fear dictate my choices, but no more. This child is mine, and I will not run from that again." The hall fell into stunned silence. Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks, but beneath the chaos, Sophia felt her knees weaken. She had dreamed of this moment, dreaded it, doubted it, and yet hearing him claim Ethan aloud still pierced her like light through darkness. Tears stung her eyes, but she held them back, rocking Ethan gently. The baby cooed, oblivious to the storm his existence had unleashed. In the hours that followed, the declaration spread across every channel. "Billionaire confesses paternity," screamed the headlines. Some commentators praised Alexander's honesty. Others scorned his delay, but all agreed the story had changed. Public sympathy shifted towards Sophia, no longer painted solely as a schemer, but as a mother who endured denial with dignity. Online, the photograph of Ethan's storm-gray eyes beside his father's became iconic, a symbol of truth that could not be buried. That night, Sophia sat in her apartment, exhaustion but hope flickering. She replayed the press conference, hearing his words again, and wondered if they were the beginning of change or merely another mask. Ethan slept soundly in his crib, tiny chest rising and falling, while outside the world debated their future. Across town, Alexander sat alone in his penthouse, the echo of his own confession ringing in his ears. For once he had not controlled the narrative, had not hidden behind lawyers or polished statements. He had spoken from a place he barely recognized, a place that terrified him. Yet when he closed his eyes, he saw Ethan's face, those storm-gray eyes unyielding, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. The truth was out. Denial was over. What came next would demand more than words. It would demand the one thing he had never learned to give freely: presence. Alexander Cross had built empires on decisiveness, on cutting through chaos with ruthless clarity. Yet when it came to fatherhood, he found himself fumbling like a man in the dark. The morning after his confession, he arrived at Sophia's apartment without entourage or chauffeur, carrying a paper bag from the local grocery store. The staff at Cross Industries would have fainted to see their CEO clutching formula cans and diapers. But Alexander only felt an unfamiliar nervousness pressing in his chest. Sophia opened the door with wary eyes. Ethan fussed in her arms, and Alexander's gaze softened at once, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside, her body tense. The apartment was modest walls lined with second-hand furniture toys tucked in a corner. Alexander set the bag on the table, suddenly aware of how out of place his tailored suit looked here. "I did not know what kind," he admitted awkwardly, gesturing to the formula. "So I bought all of them." Sophia blinked, caught between exasperation and reluctant amusement. She said nothing, only guided Ethan into his crib and began preparing a bottle. Alexander hovered restless until she handed him the warmed milk. "Try," she said, her tone almost a challenge. His hands, accustomed to steering billion-dollar deals, shook slightly as he cradled his son for the first time. Ethan latched onto the bottle, tiny fingers brushing against Alexander's cuff. Something in that small touch broke down walls that had stood for decades. Alexander swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. Hours passed filled with small, clumsy moments that stitched themselves into fragile beginnings. He burped Ethan with too much force, earning a laugh from Sophia she quickly tried to hide. He fumbled with a diaper, muttering curses under his breath, and she guided his hands patiently despite herself. In those moments, the air between them softened not enough to erase the past, but enough to remind Sophia of the man who once whispered, "Stay." Yet trust was not won overnight. When Alexander left that evening, Sophia stood at the window, Ethan in her arms watching his sleek car disappear. She whispered to her son, "We will see if he returns." And he did, again and again, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing but his presence. One night Sophia woke to the sound of soft humming and found Alexander asleep in the chair by Ethan's crib, his large hand curled protectively around the baby's tiny fingers. She stood in the doorway, heart aching with confusion. Part of her wanted to push him away, to remind him of the months of denial. But another part could not ignore the sincerity etched across his sleeping face. The world outside still buzzed with scrutiny. Tabloids questioned his motives, critics claimed it was a publicity stunt. But Sophia saw what they did not, the quiet persistence of a man trying to unlearn pride. Alexander traded gala appearances for late nights at Sophia's apartment boardroom victories, for small triumphs like soothing Ethan's colic. He stumbled, he learned, he returned. Slowly, the rhythm of their lives began to shift. One evening, as rain pattered against the windows, Sophia found herself laughing at a story Alexander told about a disastrous attempt to cook dinner in his penthouse. He looked at her, then really looked, his expression softer than she remembered. For a moment, silence stretched, charged and unspoken, until Ethan stirred and broke the spell. Sophia busied herself with the baby, her cheeks warm, while Alexander exhaled, as if releasing words he dared not say. Mrs. Hernandez, ever watchful, reminded Sophia of what mattered. Consistency, not money, will heal what he broke. Sophia carried those words in her chest each time Alexander showed up again. She wrote in her notebook one night, "I do not trust yet, but I see him trying." And for the first time in months, her hand did not shake. Alexander, too, felt the shift within himself. The skyscrapers and boardrooms that once defined him seemed hollow compared to the weight of his son in his arms. He began to imagine a future not of acquisitions, but of afternoons at the park, of laughter, echoing through a home not haunted by loneliness. Redemption was not instant, but it was growing, one clumsy bottle, one late-night vigil, one hesitant smile at a time. The chill of early winter swept through Los Angeles, with a sharp wind that rattled the thin windows of Sophia's apartment. She had grown used to cold drafts and long nights, but when Ethan's cough deepened into ragged gasps, her composure crumbled. She rushed him to the emergency room, panic thrumming in her veins, as doctors whisked him away for tests. Sophia sat hunched in a plastic chair, arms wrapped around herself, trembling at every muffled cry she thought she heard through the double doors. When Alexander arrived minutes later, his tie askew and his usually perfect hair disheveled, Sophia was too distraught to question how he knew. He dropped into the seat beside her, breathless, and when she started to speak, he silenced her gently with a hand on hers. No words, only presence. Hours crawled by until the doctor finally returned, explaining that Ethan had pneumonia but was stable, requiring oxygen and careful monitoring. Relief washed through Sophia so forcefully she nearly collapsed, but Alexander steadied her, his arm firm around her shoulders. For the first time, she did not pull away. They were led to the small hospital room where Ethan lay connected to wires and machines that beeped steadily. His tiny chest rose and fell with effort, his lips parted around the oxygen tube. Sophia sank into the chair beside the bed, stroking his hair with trembling fingers. Alexander stood at the foot of the bed, his broad shoulders slumping as he stared at the fragile boy who mirrored him so completely. Hours passed in silence. Sophia whispered lullabies, her voice breaking, while Alexander remained rooted, eyes never leaving his son. At dawn, Sophia awoke to find him still there, his large hand wrapped around Ethan's tiny one, his forehead resting against the bed rail. She watched him with a mixture of disbelief and longing, her heart tugging at the sight of this man who once denied everything, now anchored here by love he could no longer deny. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes met hers, red-rimmed and raw. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I was afraid of being weak. All my life I have run from it, built walls so high no one could reach me. But now here with him, with you, I am terrified of something else. I am terrified of losing you both." The words spilled out with a vulnerability Sophia had never heard from him. They cut through her bitterness, piercing the defenses she had carefully built. She wanted to cling to her anger, to remind him of every cruel word and every denial. But the sight of him trembling beside their son stripped her resolve. She whispered back, "Then stop running." He reached for her hand, tentative as if afraid she might vanish. This time she let him hold it. The night stretched into day, and the reporters waiting outside the hospital eventually caught their chance. Cameras flashed furiously as Alexander carried Ethan in his arms when the child was finally discharged, Sophia walking close by. The image of the billionaire cradling his sick son, his expression tender and unguarded, spread like wildfire. Public opinion began to shift. Headlines softened, "Billionaire seen at son's bedside," cross shows. Humanity at last. For the first time since the scandal erupted, the world seemed to allow him a sliver of redemption. Back home, Sophia watched the news footage with cautious eyes. She could not deny the sincerity she had witnessed, the sleepless nights Alexander spent at Ethan's side, the way he whispered encouragement when the boy struggled to breathe. Yet her heart remained wary. Could he sustain this, or would the weight of his world drag him back into denial and pride? Still, she admitted something had changed. In the quiet moments when she saw Alexander rocking Ethan to sleep or making silly faces that drew giggles from their son, her chest warmed with reluctant hope. Trust was fragile, but it was sprouting like a seed in cracked earth. Alexander, too, felt the shift. For years, his life had been measured in profit margins and hostile takeovers, but now he found himself cherishing the sound of Ethan's laughter more than the applause of shareholders. He began arriving at Sophia's apartment without suits or chauffeurs, dressed simply, sometimes with takeout boxes balanced precariously in his hands. The walls between them were not gone, but they were thinning brick by brick. One evening, after Ethan had finally drifted to sleep, they sat together on the worn sofa, the hum of the city outside muffled by thin curtains. Sophia broke the silence, her voice quiet. "You hurt me more than anyone ever could." and I do not know if I can ever forget that." Alexander looked at her, his eyes steady, no longer hiding. "I do not ask you to forget. I only ask for the chance to show you who I can be now." The air between them pulsed with unspoken longing. Sophia wanted to turn away to protect her heart, but instead she found herself leaning back against the sofa, allowing the silence to wrap around them like a tentative truce. For the first time, she imagined not just surviving, but perhaps building something new, fragile and imperfect, but real. And as the night deepened, the walls that had once stood so high between them began to crumble piece by piece under the gaze of storm-gray eyes that bound them all together. The weeks that followed Ethan's illness reshaped everything. Alexander no longer tried to stage grand gestures or engineer apologies through public relations. Instead, he simply showed up. Each morning he appeared at Sophia's apartment, with coffee balanced in one hand and a newspaper tucked under his arm, his presence quiet but steady. At first, Sophia remained guarded, responding with polite nods and wary glances. But she could not ignore the way Ethan's face lit up when Alexander walked through the door. The boys' giggles filled the small apartment, laughter like sunlight breaking through winter clouds, and Sophia found herself softening in spite of the scars she carried. The tabloids still whispered, analyzing every sighting of them together, but Sophia no longer cared. What mattered were the ordinary moments that unfolded behind closed doors. Alexander knelt on the carpet, teaching Ethan how to stack wooden blocks, his expensive suit trousers creasing as he clapped for each wobbling tower. He learned to prepare bottles without spilling half the powder. He changed diapers without grimacing, and he began to read bedtime stories with a voice far gentler than the one he used to command boardrooms. Sophia often watched from the doorway, her heart torn between lingering hurt and reluctant admiration. One evening she returned from a rare shift at a friend's cafe to find Alexander asleep on the couch. Ethan curled against his chest, both breathing in rhythm. The sight rooted her to the floor, her throat tightening. It was not perfection, not forgiveness, but it was real. Slowly, the bitterness in her chest began to dissolve. Still fear shadowed her. Could she trust a man who had once humiliated her so completely? Could she risk her heart again? She kept her guard high, even as Alexander's persistence wore at its edges. One night after Ethan had fallen asleep, she finally gave voice to the question that haunted her. "Why are you really here, Alexander? Is this guilt? Obligation?" He looked at her storm-gray eyes, unflinching, and for once no mask clouded his expression. "I am here because when I look at him, I see everything I ever pretended not to need. And when I look at you, I see the one person who stood by me when I was at my weakest. I denied you both out of fear, but fear will not rule me anymore." The words settled into the air between them, heavy with truth. Sophia turned away, her heart racing, unwilling to let him see, the tears burning her eyes. She whispered softly, but not without conviction, "Then show me. Do not say it. Show me." And he did. He arrived in the rain to help when the power went out. He stood at the pediatrician's office, taking notes as if preparing for a board meeting. He fixed the leaky faucet in her kitchen, despite clumsy hands. These acts were not glamorous, not worthy of headlines, but they stitched themselves into Sophia's wary heart, each one proof that love could be presence and not performance. Weeks later, Alexander invited them both to the beach at dusk. Sophia hesitated, wary of grand gestures, but Ethan squealed at the mention of sand, and she relented. The three walked along the shoreline, the horizon painted in hues of gold and crimson. Ethan toddled ahead, squealing as waves lapped at his ankles, and Alexander chased after him, scooping him up high into the air until the boys' laughter echoed across the shore. Sophia watched her chest tight with an emotion she no longer resisted. When Alexander returned, carrying Ethan on his shoulders, he stopped before her. For a long moment they simply stood there, the sea wind whipping around them, the setting sun casting them in warm light. Sophia whispered almost to herself, "Maybe, just maybe, we can try again." Alexander's expression softened his hand, reaching tentatively for hers. This time she did not pull away. They walked together along the sand, Ethan's laughter mingling with the crash of waves, the three of them bound, not by perfection, but by fragile hope. As the sky deepened into twilight, Sophia glanced at Ethan, his gray eyes wide with wonder. She realized those eyes no longer represented only denial and pain, but also redemption and possibility. They were mirrors of the truth, yes, but also windows into a future she dared to believe in. Love was not erasing the past or pretending wounds had never been carved. Love was choosing to stay, choosing to show up, choosing presence over pride. And for the first time since that terrible day in the hospital, Sophia allowed herself to imagine a life not haunted by denial, but illuminated by second chances. Later that evening, as they packed up to leave, Sophia leaned down to whisper to Ethan, while Alexander folded the blanket behind them. "Your father may have stumbled," she said, "but look at him now. He stayed." Ethan gurgled in reply, reaching out a small hand toward Alexander, who turned at the exact moment to take it. The image etched itself into Sophia's heart, father and son hand in hand. Truth reflected in storm-gray eyes that would never again be denied. At the edge of the ocean, beneath a sky streaked with fading light, a broken family began to heal, not with fanfare or perfection, but with fragile hope, strong enough to carry them forward.